been for this man, I would perhaps not be where I am today. And I thought that that was essentially, for me, the defining moment about the new or the then and now, again, the second-term President of the United States of America. Now, somewhere there in that feeling is the essence of what we believe is a possible special communication link between us and the leadership of the United States of America. But we do realize that to keep and sustain it and to give it strength and give it viability, we need to work on our economic relationship. And therefore, I do believe that this report comes at a very, very timely moment, a moment when, as this study summarizes, we've had a fourfold increase in bilateral trade and more in investment, and the natural discourse, therefore, is a positive one. The clear, rapid, sustained employment-generating economic growth and development being vital for India, and therefore addressing these critical challenges in this report comes, as I believe, in a very beneficial and valuable way. The challenges, of course, as have been mentioned, are about the physical and policy environment that is required both within the country in domestic terms for rapid economic growth and to enhance the capacity of India as a state to be able to reach out to the United States of America, provide to the United States of America the platforms, compatible platforms, by which what we clearly aspire together and mutually is something that can be achievable. And that will be possible, obviously, if we have enhanced trade and investment flows in both directions, helping provide much greater business opportunities, and also to ensure that our reliance on each other and our compatibility and dependence on each other in the wholesome way continues to grow. The flow of capital, services, goods, and equally important for India, technology and capabilities has the potential to transform this relationship. And of course, this does not come as a one-way relationship. It must inevitably be a two-way relationship. And we've spoken of domestic environment. And I do want to explain to you, and I think it's important that our American counterparts understand the issue about domestic environment in India. We do things in India somewhat differently. Much of what we have done in terms of economic reform has been done in either an unstated manner or done in a manner that has not alarmed people who've grown up and been accustomed to a different economic model in the past. I recall in the years that I have been in government, 5 years that I was in government earlier and subsequently, we've never as a cabinet, never as a council of ministers gathered together to actually talk about what is economic reform about, except for the very first meeting that we were called to under Prime Minister when I first got to the cabinet, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, who in a sense laid bare a blueprint that had been prepared by late Mr. Rajiv Gandhi in the expectation that he would lead the country into a new era of economic reform. I had the good fortune to work then as Deputy Minister of Commerce, and the Minister of Commerce at that time was Mr. Chidambaram, none other than Mr. Chidambaram, and the Secretary of Commerce at that time was none other than Montek Singh Ahluwalia. So you couldn't have had a better ringside view of how the great minds were thinking about reform in this country. But we spoke very little about reform. We spoke about the consequences and results, good ones, of reform, but we never spoke about reform in any great detail. We never actually spoke on the philosophy of reform. We never actually spoke about reform as a very specific electoral commitment. And of course, when we needed to speak about reform, we spoke about reform with the human face, or the middle path, the Buddhist middle path. And that served us well. It served us well because it prevented the political shock. It avoided the political shock that would have come to several generations who had grown up on anything but reform as part of their intellectual diet of about the marketplace. But we know that it was important. There were compulsions, and there were aspirations, and there were opportunities that could not have been accessed but for the reform that took place. So major swift changes took place in many significant areas of human endeavor without a stated commitment to reform. Reform, therefore, came, as it were, quietly, silently. There was truly a silent revolution. The only time it became noisy, Ambassador, was when we publicly stood up and the present Prime Minister staked his government on a very specific issue of relationship with the United States of America, and that was the civil nuclear agreement. And then we became voluble. We had been a little voluble on the WTO, but we became voluble for the first time, staked our government, and then actually went into an election with the civil nuclear agreement to the United States of America as a pivotal and important and significant achievement, which tied up our concept of new relationships in a new world and an emerging global economic order where the standard points of reference in India's economic management had disappeared for no fault of ours because the world had changed. Our trade relations had changed because the world had changed. Our perception of friends and not so friendly people had changed because the world had changed. The Cold War was over. And the very purpose for which we built the platform of the NAM movement, that purpose had been served. We could now remain neutral without necessarily having to choose between poles. And therefore, neutrality became a buzzword for everybody. Everybody was neutral. There was no longer any Cold War. And this transformation came at a time when we were transforming our society. So was it the cause or the effect is something that we leave ICREER to consider in another report. I imagine that you haven't really gone into those philosophic notions this time around. I don't want to ruin the charm of reading this report on your own and coming to your own conclusions, but some of the findings there is highlighted also by Ambassador H.K. Singh, who incidentally, I must share this with you, amongst other Foreign Service officers, Ambassador H.K. Singh was also my tutor and teacher at St. Stephen's College. So while I can say that my teacher has done well, my teacher can say that his students have done well. So just coming back to the key conclusions, it's obvious, and we all know that we are two countries with great similarities, enormous similarities, but also in economic terms, we still have great dissimilarities. We are not a developed country, and the United States is in the post-development stage, if I'm not mistaken. They've been a developed country for a very long, like postmodernism, they're now into post-development. And we are still struggling struggling with development. So we want to keep you sustained as a developed country, and we want you to hold hands with us and pull us through into the level of a developed country, and that's how I think we need to work together. The political challenges that we both face in matters of promoting free trade and investment flows, internal political challenges, etc., are familiar to you. Third, the world is obviously looking at different ways. You could say that the world is getting divided into separate free trade blocks, the membership of which is cross-cutting, and we need to ask ourselves if that is sustainable. And the world is also in parallel, not as speedily, but in parallel working on the larger global picture of the WTO. Is it that the free trade regions will replace WTO entirely if WTO doesn't move? Or is it that they will finally become building blocks of WTO? The fundamental principles, obviously, as India negotiates these arrangements in our own region, as indeed beyond our region, the ASEAN, European Union, and the United States of America, the fundamental principles that we have espoused and we've held up, held up for the world are fundamental principles that largely, with some modification, obviously, will continue to apply to our negotiations. Fourthly, there's need for a positive approach on both sides, and that can be underscored many times over. And as the report suggests, I find it says, I quote, both sides have to go beyond the litany of complaints that hold each other responsible. And that's, of course, I think, very important. Is the glass half full? Is the glass half empty? Something that can simply state what we need to do. And I think we've done that. We've looked at the brighter side and tried to get away from the darker issues, and that's how it's worked well. And of course, fifthly, it needs to be recognized that India has actually been quite proactive in negotiating BITs and CEPAs. India has more BITs in place than the United States of America. And I just want to not really add a word of caution, but bring you on board about one very important issue. And the important issue is that we've been talking about bilateral and investment trade treaties in a somewhat segregated manner. We still, in our country, thinking in silos. And when I say that we are thinking in silos, we still suffer from the unstated philosophy or philosophical principle of reform. Reform equal to free market, equal to disinvestment, equal to privatization, because many of these words are still to reach a comfort level with the large sections of our society. Not because they have an inherent ideological opposition to them, but simply because we haven't tried hard enough to explain to our people and to be willing to take the risk of putting some of these ideas as ideas on which an election can be won or lost. We don't want to lose an election because people don't understand reform. We want to win an election and continue to offer reform to them. That's the way we work. And therefore, you would find that sometimes people in government in this country take up a position that they then promptly oppose when they get into opposition. And that's not because we are hypocritical. That's only because we are not strong enough in political ideology. And I think we have to strengthen our political ideology and be willing and be prepared to fight, win, and lose elections on stated economic principles. But we'll get there. That's a process. There's a process of maturity in the electoral political atmosphere, and I'm sure that we will get there in due course. And I should add that for the present, I doubt that there will be a great appetite amongst developing countries for what the report describes as high standards of WTO plus agreements. And that's, I think, there for everyone to see. This is something that even where something not related to the BIT, the report, for instance, correctly notes frustration amongst Indian IT and IT-enabled services firms in the high visa rejection rates. We also see a need, as has been mentioned, to start a serious discussion on the totalization agreement. We need to address the resentment of professionals who contribute to the social security system, which they can never use. It's hard to justify this in the matter of US when we've concluded similar agreements with G8 economies. But I believe that this is work in progress. It's not something that, again, as I said, is a negative dimension that should hold us back. I do agree that the central thesis of this report, it's correct that the India-US bilateral investment treaty is undoubtedly desirable. The report also suggests that this can be done in the near term. This is certainly an ambitious suggestion, I believe. I think we have to work very hard to see if we can achieve it, if not in near terms, in not so near terms. On the other hand, while the goal may be common, both sides need to agree on how we get there, and I think that's the important work that we have to do over the next few months. In other words, we need to agree on the model of BIT that we can accept, as Ambassador H.K. Singh has very eloquently said to us already. The point that I thought that I will share with you is lack of clarity on what is the reason and purpose and objective of such investment and trade treaties is essentially what has caused some of our top institutions to investment that took place in this country and then caused a question mark on our investment climate. Those of you who follow the Supreme Court would know that when we sought an advisory opinion from the Supreme Court, we placed about 9 questions before them, 5 of which we thought were very, very important questions. And the Supreme Court said in its judgment that it will answer 5. But the Supreme Court actually ended up answering only 4. The 5th question was a very significant question. And that 5th question was, in deciding what relief to give, should the courts of the land factor in implications on the international economic relationship of the country, i.e., should they factor in such treaties and agreements that reflect upon economic arrangements and economic relationships. And I say this because whenever common law courts decide an issue, they decide not only between 2 parties in front of it, but also decide in terms of implications for third-party rights. Courts always do that. Courts always look at what is practically the best way to solve a solution. For instance, master-servant cases, those who are familiar with contract law will know that in master-servant cases, injunctions are not granted. Even specific relief, as it's called, is not granted. But the court limits relief to damages because the courts believe that you cannot force somebody to work for somebody who doesn't want that person to work for them. But certainly relief can be given by simply saying that this is equal to so much by way of damages, and that would compensate the loss that you have suffered. Now, that's the kind of thing that I believe the courts would inevitably do if the courts were fully on board and were familiar, and our system allowed the courts to become familiar with this vast new array of arrangements that we are making across the globe, which have a lot to do with understanding of fundamental economic issues and how the global economic systems work. And I hope that that will happen one day, very soon, when the Supreme Court is made aware of the far-reaching consequences and implications of judgments where this is not taken into account, as we found that it is yet to be answered in that presidential reference that we placed before the Supreme Court. So when we begin to review our past agreements, we review our past agreements partly because the realization that it leads to consequences that could be crippling, but also because we are still uncertain that the courts would take into account such agreements. In many countries, such agreements do not require parliamentary legislation. They can be ratified through a procedure that does not involve parliamentary legislation. But in India, parliamentary legislation becomes necessary. So without parliamentary legislation, the courts may not automatically be able to look at them. Although our experience is in the area of climate change, in the area of environment, in the area of human rights, and vast commitments that we have made to the world about rights governance, including on freedom from corruption, the courts have taken on board international agreements without there being parliamentary legislation to support it. And therefore, I do hope that one day we will see a lot more and a better understanding of this as far as the judicial system is concerned, in which case we will be certainly more comfortable. I think we've had enough to reflect upon, and I would therefore, in closing, once again congratulate Ambassador H.K. Singh and Ms. Solomon for putting together this very thoughtful and a very, very useful, timely document. It is a valuable contribution to the discourse on bilateral partnership. The report provides significant data, as you've just been told, collected in one place. Its recommendations are addressed equally to both sides and are certainly worthy of study. And if I recommend the report to all of those you who are interested in bilateral relationship and those who are not here but are interested, I obviously am recommending it to myself as well. I thank you for your attention, and I hope that this will become an important landmark in the relationship that we value, cherish, and that we want to build on. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.